Yeah, a chatbot will never admit that it's wrong unless you call it out on its bull crap. And it's also never going to just provide something that says, I don't know, or anything like that. It will give you an answer no matter what you ask it.
Welcome back to Tree Hugger Podcast, a show about ecological restoration, environmental justice, plants, people, power, and the messy, beautiful work of tending damaged places. I'm your host, Michael Yadrick. I'm a restoration ecologist, a plant person, a podcast maker, and somebody who spends a lot of time thinking about what restoration is really for, who it serves, and what kinds of futures we're building when we decide to intervene in a landscape. Before we get going, a quick invitation. If you're looking for help with restoration strategy, climate adaptation, ecological storytelling, public engagement, or just trying to think more critically and creatively about what your restoration could be, you can work with me through Madrone Grove Adaptation and Restoration, a little business I started last year. I'm up and running, so feel free to reach out. And if you want more of the writing and reflection side of this work, you can also listen to the podcast there. Check out my Substack, Grove and Grit, where I write about restoration, ecology, language, justice, and the stories we tell ourselves about damaged and changing places. And truly, thank you for listening. Thank you for supporting independent podcasting. I appreciate y'all coming back for conversations like this that live somewhere between field notes, philosophy, and critique. This show exists because people care about these questions and because enough of you still want something slower, weirder, more relational, and less polished than the usual hot takes and algorithm sludge. And that's why I love you. Today's episode is kind of a return conversation. I often reflect on past episodes and discussions I've had. This is one that's been sitting with me for a while. A couple years ago, back in 2024, the way back, I had Timothy Pape and Sam Woodrich on the podcast to talk about artificial intelligence and ecological restoration. At the time, the conversation felt a little speculative. AI was already here, of course, but it still felt like something we were circling, asking what it might become, wondering how it might get folded into our work. And for a lot of you out there, it's something you neglected to even think about as a tool. That's okay. Now it is 2026, and the question is not really whether AI is entering restoration. It already has. We may be slow adopters in our industry, but it's in our classrooms, it's in the offices, it's embedded within our Google searches, and probably our blind spots too. Since our last conversation, Tim and Sam published a new paper that takes the question further. Instead of just asking philosophically whose values might shape these tools, they actually tested how mainstream chatbots generate ecological restoration plans across North American ecoregions. They looked at responses from ChatGPT, Copilot, and Gemini, and what they found was telling. Across 45 AI-generated restoration plans, the most common prescriptions were overwhelmingly to plant native species and remove invasive plants. Other themes showing up much less often. The broader pattern they found was a strong overrepresentation of vegetation-focused restoration and an underrepresentation of hydrological, social, and economic dimensions. The prescriptions did not vary much by ecoregion either. So whether the degraded site was in a desert, a temperate forest, or the Arctic tundra, the machine kept reaching for the same basic script. Plant natives, remove invasives, maybe enhance soil, maybe reduce erosion, maybe engage the community in some vague and tidy way. Now, to be clear, these are not bad recommendations. A lot of us in restoration do, in fact, spend a huge amount of time removing overabundant species and planting desired vegetation. Those are real tasks. They are often the most visible, fundable, and legally straightforward things we can do. If you look up ecological restoration online, you'll find a lot of that. These are often the activities you can actually implement without setting off a chain reaction of permits, liability questions, regulatory review, wildlife complications, or impossible budgets. It is a lot easier to tell someone to cut ivy and plant trees than it is to navigate the social and legal complexity of reintroducing beavers or salmon, changing hydrology, removing roads, addressing heat islands, confronting land tenure, and even those harder questions about whether a place is even worth restoring or needs to be restored, and for whom. And that, I think, is part of what makes this conversation so interesting, because some of us are using chatbots and AI in restoration, whether openly or quietly, critically or casually. Some of us are using it to brainstorm restoration goals when a site file is thin and the story of a place has gone missing. Some of us are using it to summarize technical reports, codes, old plans, dense monitoring memos, those slim 250-page docs, even botanical inventories. Some of us are using it to compare planting palettes, translating language into plain speech, structuring work plans, drafting language, and sometimes, honestly, that can help as a starting point. If you're starting with a blank page and trying to imagine something for a site, AI can give you something to react to stew on. If you're trying to synthesize huge amounts of information quickly, it can rapidly help find a pattern. It can sometimes do that faster than your tired human brain can do after a long day of field work, 5 meetings like I had today, or putting out, everyday fires. But there's a difference between a useful starting point and actually gaining wisdom about an ecosystem, differences between a plausible recommendation and one that's really situated in the real world context. And that's where Tim and Sam's work lands. Their earlier article argued that ecological restoration is inherently shaped by values and that AI tools are not neutral. They are built by people trained on particular kinds of data and constrained in how well they can account for plural, shifting, place-based values. In that paper, they pushed on the deeper question of whose values inform a project, and they argue that even if AI can help with modeling and planning, its capacity is limited when it comes to integrating the messy, contested, relational dimensions of restoration work. So the newer study gives us something more empirical. If I haven't said it yet, you can find it in the show notes. It shows what these systems actually do when asked to write restoration prescriptions. And what they do mostly is repeat the dominant restoration discourse back to us. That alone is worth paying attention to. Because for many restorationists, the challenge is not just ecological degradation, it is also narrative degradation, institutional amnesia, missing site history, thin context, flattened language, a file with almost nothing in it, a map without a story, a degraded site adjacent to treaty land, red-line neighborhoods, industrial pollution, heat exposure, or a long history of displacement, and yet the tools at hand keep trying to tell you the problem is just the weeds. And honestly, that comes up in a lot of my conversations, and this one too. Sometimes the issue is not a lack of data exactly, but that the data is fragmented, hidden, obscure, locked away somewhere, or disconnected from the human and political story of a place. There may be urban heat in one corner, redlining history in another, tree history somewhere else, and then site observations, local knowledge, and vegetation patterns all floating around without a coherent narrative or a steady tether in the internet. So in those cases, AI can sometimes help stitch a rough frame together, but it may not exactly know the place and where it's going. So wrapping this intro up, we've revisited that earlier conversation with fresh evidence in hand, but we also move into another piece that often gets left out of the conversation, which is the environmental footprint of AI itself. Because if you work in restoration, you are already thinking about energy, water, land, and climate impacts. You're thinking about extraction, infrastructure, and mitigation. So it would be pretty strange to talk about AI as a clean and abstract helper without talking about what it physically requires. Data centers use land, they use electricity, they use water for cooling. Unless they're shot up into space, they have material and territorial footprints on Earth. So there's a paradox here. We are increasingly turning to energy-intensive, water-intensive computational systems to help us think about healing damaged ecosystems. That tension belongs in restoration conversations. It belongs here. So today we sit with that tension and those hard questions. Thanks for popping in. Here's the conversation. All right. So for listeners who didn't catch the earlier episode, I was looking way back 2024.
Oh,
Way back then. Could each of you introduce yourselves again and say a little bit about your passions? Could be personal, could be professional, could be whatever is lighting your fire right now. And how you got interested in the intersection of AI and ecological restoration?
My name's Timothy Pape. I'm an assistant professor at Bowling Green State University. Some of my interests have to do with ecological restoration and social science as it relates to environmental studies. We were just also talking before we started Earth-space governance and thinking of systems thinking as it relates to things even beyond Earth and how that might affect sustainability policy and practices here on Earth. So yes, some of my passions, I'm interested in hiking. I went to the Smokies for the first time last week, which was pretty cool. So it was really nice. And my wife and I play Magic the Gathering. So that's one of our passions. We cast spells at each other. So thanks again for having us.
Hi, my name is Sam Woodrich. I'm a PhD student at Oregon State University. I'm in the Environmental Sciences graduate program. I study ecology in general, but specifically I study the effects of apex predators or lack thereof on riparian systems in the Oregon coast. I'm currently writing my dissertation. I have been writing for the last 2 years or so, and I'm hoping to get out this year, 2026. Can't wait to listen to this back later on and either flub that up really badly or be very happy and proud of myself to actually get out in time. I have just, like I said, been writing a lot, but I'm eager to get out into the field. I have a couple of projects lined up and experiment studies that I want to get going. One of them, it consists of going to Yellowstone to look at the effects of beaver since the reintroduction of wolves in the northern parts of Yellowstone. I'm looking forward to that. It has been dreary and wet here for the last couple of weeks in Salem, Oregon, and things are just starting to pop out of the ground. So I'm looking forward to looking at flowers and bird watching as well. And finally, when I'm not doing stuff outside or I'm not writing, I've also been picking up a D&D campaign. Never really played Magic the Gathering, so I haven't tried that, but I have been on a couple month-long campaign as a dungeon master. So that's been fun.
All right. I'm going to have to slip in some Magic and D&D questions at the end, maybe in the rapid fire questions.
Sure.
Rapid fire. We can spend ample
Noted.
time on that if need be.
The ecosystems of D and the Magic. Okay. Super. All right. Lots of change. Happy spring. Yeah. Everyone looks healthy. You said getting out, and I was like, actually, it looks like you brought nature indoors. Yeah, you
Plants
can't be
inside, I think,
outside. Yeah. Just bring the plants inside. So as far as the artificial intelligence front, has anything changed since 2024? You think any practitioners have been picking up AI, or is it just y'all are asking the kind of deeper questions?
Sam and I talked about this a good amount when we first started this article, is that it just felt like the use of chatbots had increased in just a few years, that I think there were a lot of people using chatbots in 2024, 2023, but it just feels like it's really ubiquitous these days for ideation. And as a professor, I know that my students are using it often to brainstorm. And so I think we felt like our first article kind of looked at what values are inherent in these tools. I think we were just like, okay, well, what also is the preferences and biases that are like in these tools as well, especially if they're becoming even more frequent rates.
I think in 2024, when we were writing our first paper, it was more of a question of how is AI going to be integrated into restoration ecology and ecology in general. And now in 2026, it's more of looking at what is young and up and coming students using AI for, how is it affecting their development? How is it affecting their productivity? What kind of data analysis is capable now of someone who's just entering undergraduate research or people that are getting their PhD? And we're seeing that sophisticated analysis has grown substantially. People are asking harder questions with less data, but we're also seeing that there's, at least in my personal opinion, there's people that are falling back on their writing abilities or maybe critical thinking abilities. But I think we're just in some shallow waters right now, just wading through and figuring out what is useful for AI and what should be left for humans to really discern and use their critical thinking abilities to solve in at least academia.
Yeah, and Sam and I had also mentioned, we mentioned at the end of the article, that the sourcing of information on a lot of these tools is pretty black box. And so that is also something we felt was worth exploring, even though we don't have obviously where they're sourcing these things from, to just see if we took 3 chatbots, asked them similar questions, would they have similar answers? Because if they did, then it felt they were sourcing presumably from similar places. And that made us sort of go, okay, some of these are not operating in such different spaces. They're actually culling through similar data. thusly, like whatever chatbot you use, you may be getting broadly, especially if it relates to ecological restoration, similar answers. And we thought that was worth figuring out if that was true. And then based on at least our one study and the 3 chatbots we engaged with, it did seem to be true.
Yeah, I appreciate y'all digging into this and putting some sunshine on this. This paper that just came out, I think January 2026. Congratulations. You're testing how chatbots generate restoration plans across North America, right? What do we find when we ask AI to write restoration prescriptions? It looks like you all focused on Chat, Copilot, and Gemini. And I think some of us are forced in our institutions, forced into using Copilot, let's say. And then some of us, I think, in our personal lives use other AI or nothing at all. And there's also a lot of hype about Claude lately. I don't know if you care about distinguishing between all of them, but it looks like there's some benefits, but also some blind spots.
Succinctly put, we found that chatbots in general made vegetation prescriptions in their ecological restoration plans. And the 2 specific outputs that they gave most frequently were remove invasive species and plant native species, mainly plants. We also found that there was a lack of economic and social prescriptions in all chatbot responses between Copilot, Gemini, and ChatGPT. And we also found that there was not very many changes between ecoregions. We used just the stage 1 ecoregions for North America and then just use that as a sample to generate prescriptions across all ecoregions and then do analysis between each ecoregion. We didn't see very much difference in them at all. And then for chatbots themselves, unsurprisingly, paid subscription chatbots like ChatGPT at the time gave more in-depth analysis and prescriptions, while Copilot and Gemini did not give as much in-depth descriptions in their restoration plans. But overall, they all seem to source similar information, give a same vague prescription for each ecoregion type in general.
Yeah, I think what Sam just said there, the sort of vagueness of the prescriptions was something we noted in the article. Enhanced soil health, enhanced wildlife habitat, community engagement were the 3rd, 4th, and 5th most prescribed practices. But we felt that because plant native species and remove invasive species were so much more prioritized over anything else, that was pretty notable. And we also discussed, because, Sam and I know a little bit about ecological restoration. We're like, if you were to ask a restoration practitioner, what kind of things should you be doing on a degraded site? They often would default to, well, are there invasives? You should probably remove those. What's the species sort of distribution look like? Maybe you need some more native. So these aren't like inherently wrong prescriptions, but we just felt that they also felt very narrow. I think was what we kind of would often say is that they felt very repetitive, which also is why we didn't go past 45 total, because we just felt, okay, once you start hearing the same story over and over again, you don't maybe need to keep collecting data. And we felt we'd read these 200-word plans and we'd sort of say plant natives, remove invasives, and then special option 3 was usually the other. Also reduce erosion, maybe, question mark. Also maybe site monitoring. There's a 3rd one based, we often would say maybe on the ecoregion. Managed grazing was one that we were like, oh, well, it's because it's a grassland ecoregion that's basically saying managed grazing. And so we thought the others were usually maybe context specific, but plant native species was just like, a chatbot almost couldn't think about ecological restoration without immediately saying, make sure you're planting natives, which again is interesting and not inherently wrong, but does feel like there are these sort of preferences that chatbots are pushing.
Yeah, and that's, I think, what most of us do. I think if we surf the internet, it's killing weeds and plant trees. That's what you find, right? Or that's what the Google algorithm finds if you look up ecological restoration. But I think it's maybe 2 of the most accessible sort of activities that anyone can do, because we're allowed to do that pretty much almost anywhere without restrictions or permits or whatever. Yeah. So like reintroducing like an endangered butterfly, right, requires permits, or like massive soil enhancements. Yeah, it's pretty expensive. So it's like the lowest bar. So
I don't know that we ever thought about that to some degree, which is like, they like cheap and easy ways to some degree compared to, oh, you want to put trapped beavers into this like area? Like, do you have some nuisance beavers to start with? Hey, do you have the laws and regulations allowed to do that?
I think that the limitation for how much these chatbots were allowed, quote unquote, allowed to generate, since we set a hard count of 200 words or less, really restricts their ability to give more in-depth answers in general. There was an interesting comment that we received on our first submission of our paper where one of the editors referenced another chatbot questionnaire from a different ecological study. And they were stating that using the chatbots as a language system to generate one answer is actually negating their whole ability, since they're inherently built to give multiple answers through conversation. So in hindsight, I think if we were to run this test again, though I don't know how we would structure it, we would try to integrate how chatbots are structured for communication in general, whether it's having multiple dialogue between a user and a chatbot or some other way of integrating that. So while vegetation and remove invasive species, I agree, is like an ecological no-brainer to doing restoration, I also think that there's just so much information out there that these chatbots are sourcing that it just happens to be the first thing that they prescribe, since their abundance of their sources recommend it.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess, so my takeaway, obviously what y'all just said, that the ecological actions are in there, even though they're superficial, but then that social and economic dimensions are pretty much absent, because we do want to engage different knowledge systems and local expertise as well. So it kind of reveals the knowledge that these guys have been trained on, right? So I am wondering if it does improve with use, like it gets to know y'all, like through the course of the many months that you're interacting with it too, because that's its ability too, right?
Right. And we structured it where it was just an anonymous user making one post and giving it back. So you're right. The learning that it would do over time with a user would probably influence its responses.
And that's a really interesting thought too, because again, part of the reason we structured the study was to say, what is its initial preference from a restoration prescriptions perspective? Because if you as a user know, well, it's going to for sure give me vegetative prescriptions, you can ask that first prompt like we did. And then you could say, okay, can you give me other prescriptions that are not remove invasives and not plant natives? And presumably, then the next response is not going to have those as the next thing that it offers to you. And in that situation, it may then start to say, oh, well, water management is maybe something you want to consider, or community engagement. And I think that's actually gets to the heart of why the article, I think we thought had some relevance, is that you as a user need to be able to navigate that from an ecological restoration perspective. Because if you don't know, as we all sort of on here kind of do, that like, obviously you rip out weeds and you plant natives. If you know that, then you can go like to whatever chatbot tool you're using, please go deeper. I know that those are two things I should consider. But if you don't know that, because you're limited in your actual maybe education or information or knowledge you have in regards to ecological restoration, you might just be think that that's how all restoration kind of functions. And then there's some other things you could do on the fringe. But I think that goes back to our first article, which is like, what values are driving these tools? And if you interact with a tool long enough, your values start driving the answers, presumably, because there has been some sort of research that's come out that says the tool starts to adapt to your interaction and starts to some degree feedback loop to you what you are requesting and asking. And so I don't know, that's not a bad thing. I mean, it could be a very good thing that at some point the tool is actually mirroring your values to some degree. But then that goes very much in counter to what I think a lot of people do with these tools, is they present them as these sort of like objective ways of getting information delivered to you, right? That is the idea with a lot of AI analysis tools is, hey, I'm going to objectively give you information and then you can decide how you want to use it, as opposed to, you know, like we're seeing that with some other sort of social media platforms that start to create a echo chamber of your own sort of things, as opposed to saying, here's other information or other news. Chatbot tool ends up doing that. In some ways, that could be even more problematic potentially, because it's just feeding you back what you want and want to hear if it can determine that potential.
That's what I remember from our last conversation as well. In your last paper was like focus on whose values are espoused in this interacting with artificial intelligence and having it tell you how to or navigate through ecological restoration projects. So that's super enlightening. I will tell you, in my experience, sometimes the data is obscure. I like to focus on climate adaptation and heat. And so sometimes there's these weird data sets that like belongs to the city and maybe isn't public, about urban heat index. Let's say this is just yesterday, honestly. I was like planning and trying to justify some projects for this remnant Gary Oak site a couple of miles away, actually, and talking about the heat and how much would it, compared to the census block, that and the lack of tree canopy in the neighborhood, like this one site has a lot of tree canopy cover. It exists between Interstate 5 and the neighborhood too. So there's lots of pollution. And so there's heat coming off the freeway. And so heat is elevated in this part of town. And then pointing to the critical ecology of this neighborhood is formerly redlined and pointing to that sort of data too, just to tell the story. But that's just me, I guess.
Because I think what you just said there is to what both of our chats have kind of talked about, which is what is ecological restoration for, right? That's the heart of any of these kind of questions. And I feel like that's a pretty deep, critical question to ask. And I think Sam and I felt through writing this paper that we were like, AI is limited in its ability to critically ask that. Like, we never got a response that was like, should you even be restoring this region? Who are you trying to deliver benefits to in this particular region? And there was occasionally some sort of vague kind of throwaway at the end in the final sentence or two that's, well, engage with the community and make sure they're on board, because that is a good way of performing ecological restoration. So we did get those. That's why it's represented a little bit in the paper. But we never got those kind of, I can't even answer this question because it didn't want to go in that direction. And maybe that's what the tool's not meant to do that. I think to what you were just like, that is what humans struggle through is, well, this is a district that maybe needs certain benefits that another area maybe wouldn't need from a restoration project.
We were trying to capture that with having different ecoregions standardized across all chatbots. And one of the earliest hypotheses we had was there would be substantial difference between ecoregions. Just thinking as a restoration ecologist or as anyone, you would not prescribe the same restoration initiatives in the desert as you would like the Oregon coastal forests or you would the Arctic tundra. But even in the tundra is a great example, because even in the Arctic tundra, it's still remove invasive species, plant native ones. Whereas even though I'm not an expert in working in that system, that can't possibly be the very first thing I would address as a restoration ecologist, in my opinion. Likewise, I wanted to touch base real quick with the depth of responses. Interestingly enough, we saw more in-depth responses for planting native vegetation, because in certain ecoregions with mainly ChatGPT, but some other chatbots, they would give very specific species of what should be planted. Now, on the contrary, when you had the rare prescription for social values, for connecting stakeholders, for engaging local community members, for using traditional ecological knowledge, any of those instances, there was never in a single time a suggestion of a local indigenous people or a local stakeholder or government or community or anything. So I only have hypotheses as to why that's the case. But again, chatbots are sourcing information, at least for vegetation, from a myriad of studies, from publications, from restoration papers, from backgrounds, whatever it is. And it's summarizing these specific species should be planted in these ecosystems. But on the contrary, it's also looking at social and economic data and not summarizing or even suggesting any sort of people or groups to talk to for these ecoregions.
Yeah, I find myself having to insert that every once in a while. There's one site nearby. When I first went into our files, it was just like empty. And I was supposed to write a restoration plan for this. I was like, what is the story here? And I asked my supervisor, a couple folks, I was like, what's the story of M Slope? Right? It's just like this. And I had to fabricate it on my own, right? It's adjacent to the Medicine Creek Treaty land from the 1860s, the treaty with the Puyallup people and some other local tribes. And it actually, the reservation line cuts right through it. And there's this history of allotment and everything. So I had to like create this story and dig deeper into like random plans, like comp plans from like the 1990s and whatnot. So in absence of a story, you need to get out and talk to people and then just like insert that information. Because otherwise, when you talk about indigenous folks whose land we're working on, it will just say, maybe generally it'll be like, you live in the Coast Salish region of the Pacific Northwest, but it won't say specifically like the tribe whose land you're on, right? So that's what I'm finding. Yeah, more and more. It's like the nuance is missing.
To what you just said there, and I think these tools are getting better in time, especially as a chatbot. the chatbot wants to deliver something so that you'll use that chatbot again, presumably. The people are making these tools don't want to make chatbots that you use once, say that was stupid and never use it. So in some ways, like we didn't expect a chatbot to come back and say, where in this ecoregion are you actually working? One or two of them did say, depending on where you are in this ecoregion, there might be some variance to what I'm suggesting. One or two of them did. But again, like it may have been 2 or 3 of the 45 responses. And so I think, again, to what we're talking about, well, if the chatbot itself thinks, hey, I'm a conversational tool, it almost seems that it should have said, I don't have enough information to give you what you want. So please keep engaging with me. And instead it said, sure, got it. Here's your 200 words response. It's pretty good. You don't have to look too deep into this. And we were like, okay, well, like that's necessary to be reported out. Like we need people to understand that like that is a very surface level kind of engagement with the idea of ecological restoration. Not necessarily one that doesn't help get your brain going and help see the gaps or point you to other information, but it is not as in-depth as maybe it should be, and is not as analytical even in its response as maybe we all want to think it.
Yeah, a chatbot will never admit that's wrong unless you call it out on its bull crap, and it's also never going to just provide something that says, I don't know, or anything like that. It will give you an answer no matter what you ask it.
Right. So speaking of removing invasives, we had a citywide data set and it talks about a presence of weed species or overabundant species. And basically, I think most chatbots would be like, remove all these because, despite the context, like they're going to dominate and they're going to take over and they're the worst thing. But really, it's 1 out of the 15 that are named are actually regulated and required for removal, right, by the state. But other ones are like highly recommended. So it's really at our discretion that we remove them in an appropriate and responsible way and revegetate. So yeah, that's come up for me as well.
That's one of the later questions, but just removing invasives is such a, again, context specific, I think, description that like,
when it comes to delivering beavers to a spot, because we know beavers are like the God-given solution to a lot of things. Can't imagine the prescriptions that it would lay out for you. Or just go pick up your lonely wolf that's isn't part of a pack anymore and translocate them across state lines to your ecosystem where you want wolves. There's a lot of like social dynamics and reintroduction predators into places.
And along those lines, the enhanced wildlife habitat was often, I would say, built around the idea that there are species who need to be prioritized, but we didn't actually find much reintroduce a non-vegetative species usually. So, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. We found that there was, I don't know the chatbot, but there was only one instance where it says reintroduce apex predators. And if I find it, I will mention what chatbot and what species it was. But Tim and I just made a big note of, oh, look here, this is the only one.
We hope
to
some degree. Maybe that'll keep popping up because it is a prescription that can be quite valuable from a trophic cascade perspective. But we were just like, okay, one chatbot sees that as a possibility.
Yeah. The taiga ecoregion for Copilot was reintroduce wolves and lynx to help regulate prey populations and restore natural predator-prey dynamics. Pretty much the most generic welcome to trophic cascades question you could get in your intro ecology.
In the Wayback Machine too, I interviewed Laura J. Martin, who wrote this book about the rise of ecological restoration, just talked about the intricacies of law. We were allowed to rip out plants because they're seen as non-sentient or whatever, and basically allowed to like decide who lives and dies with plants. But then with animals, it's a whole different story, right? Even with salmon, highly regulated, butterflies, lynx, wolves, beavers even.
Oh yeah,
it's tougher.
And the terms native and invasive are very like loaded and normative.
Yeah. I've met several ecologists that wouldn't mind removing an invasive plant, but would be troubled by removing any invasive amphibian or other living quote species.
Yeah, we have city stormwater ponds. Talking with Department of Fish and Wildlife folks, there's some invasive, like bullfrogs, let's say, but also some other non-native fish. And they dropped the suggestion of removing those or trapping those. I was like, oh, that's not my job. I can't touch animals. A lot of municipalities at least don't have wildlife programs, but they definitely have veg management programs. So it's like totally outside the paradigm of a lot of people's restoration operations.
It's really all in the perspective of who's managing it and the community's understanding ecology.
So I want to move on because there's a question we didn't get into last time, but I think it might be worthwhile just because we do spend a lot of time thinking about damaging and degrading impacts. And so AI itself has this environmental footprint of, what we read about with big data centers, the demand on electricity, cool, clean water for cooling these systems. This deeper philosophical question, how should we think about, or have you thought about the ecological costs of using AI tools themselves?
Yeah, it's a pretty hot topic at Bowling Green State University because we have a large data center being built just down the road, and people have certain feelings about that. There's a large, like you said, water use, maybe a little less than it used to be, but electricity is a huge piece of it. And also the land use. That's sort of one undercounted one. I think people are always like, oh, water, electricity. It was like, that land could have been anything else. Now it's a data center. And maybe there are jobs that are going to be made. Maybe this is going to help us to have tools to be able to do our jobs better. I think AI and the infrastructure that is required for AI that is being built is something that requires some kind of critical thinking, maybe, of how much is needed, how often are we using these tools, what resources are we giving to these sort of infrastructure components. Yeah, and that's, again, to your point, it's a pretty philosophical question and a bigger question. Just if everyone stopped, paused, think, and said, do I need to ask a chatbot this thing, or can I do it in a different way? Then those tools, I mean, the reason we're building all these data centers is because everybody's asking chatbots, like, how do I make eggs taste better? And they're asking chatbot, like, what's a good area for me to run and go on a jog in my neighborhood? I mean, they are asking, I want to outsource all decision-making to some degree to these tools. And thusly, like, we need the processing power and the data centers to, like, do that. And so, like, that is the big crux. I mean, I often say to my students, please just write your own thoughts in your reading reflection, because of course you could put in this article and ask it to give me 2 paragraphs of a summation that, like, critically engages with it. But I'd rather you write me sentences that, like, are borderline nonsense and maybe don't have proper grammar, but are your own thoughts about this article, because then you've actually engaged with it and you've actually sort of thought about it, and you've not just asked AI to give you, like, cliff notes. But that's, you can ask, you can say, this is the value I think we should have is on that, but that doesn't mean it's going to happen.
I have mixed feelings on this, and I honestly hadn't thought of it too much. But at this moment, I think artificial intelligence plays a tremendous role in a technological leap, similar to having computers, inventing calculators, or just the ability to quantify mass amounts of data and analyze it instantaneously is a huge tool that will be used in all sorts of research for eons from now, as long as, there's still resources to power these data centers and water and electricity. On the contrary, the questions that maybe are being asked by masses amounts of people are not useful. They're not using this technology to the full potential, and it uses just as much water, electricity, and resources to ask, where am I going to run in my neighborhood, as it does to analyze or conduct a statistical analysis of your data. Chatbots don't care what you're asking. It's still going to cost the same amount of resources. Another perspective I have too, specifically with restoration or just ecology in general, is that there's not a lot of money in investing or in improving chatbots or artificial intelligence for the mass market, especially for environmental or ecological issues. There's far more investment going towards automating everyday life for people, for having something in your kitchen all the time ready to listen to you at all instances and provide ingredients, instructions, whatever it is for someone who's cooking. All that has much more financial incentive than our thought piece on restoration ecology, or like generating chatbot responses for restoration work. So I don't think people should be feeling personally responsible for using chatbots for scientific purposes, for asking depth questions, for doing analysis, or for summarizing information. I think that's the intended purpose of this technology is for. But I do think that you should have some critical thinking skills and develop yourself personally by asking simple questions, or by doing your own research, or by doing your own homework and talking with community members, or whatever it is can be easily replaced by asking ChatGPT or some other Claude or anything like that.
Those are great answers. Yeah, I do feel like there's some analogy to like the pollution or littering sort of discussion where we're like, there's like the guilt, we're individually responsible for things and collectively it adds up. But really, I don't know. I just default to blaming capitalism for a lot of things. And the massive like institutional like data processing that happens, I think is maybe more in charge, more responsible. I think we know where to point fingers, I guess. So
We're comfy that way too.
yeah,
If you
yeah,
point
it's
to
like
something you
comfortable.
can't control.
Seriously. Yeah, we'll just pause there then. All right. If you're ready for lightning round questions, here we go. Please complete this provocation. Restoration is blank.
Interesting.
Changing.
All right. What's the strangest ecological recommendation you've seen from one of the chatbots?
Copilot said that, well, the coastal marine forest ecosystem, well, let's just call it Pacific Northwest, in the same response said you should remove and add dams to hydrological systems.
Yep. That was a good,
Mm,
which
wow.
in some ways, if you actually think about it, is both nonsensical and also, well, we're talking about it from a restoration perspective. Had the actual response said, well, dams can have some sort of safety or like social perfect, but it didn't. And that's why we're like, well, it feels like it's trying to be nuanced here and instead sounds like it's crazy.
Okay. A most overrated restoration technique.
Yeah. Again, that's a context specific one, but I think you mentioned it. And I feel like that, not to bias our own research, but I do feel like remove invasives. That can sometimes feel like when that's just a default, take this out, it wasn't here when whatever historical benchmark I want to use was. I think that one can sometimes be one that is like a bazooka when it maybe needs to be a little different. So.
Yeah. In the absence of any other restoration plan or prescription, removing invasive species could be done every single year for eons.
Forever. It's maintenance. All right. And I had this question, but I'm going to change it a little bit. So if an ecosystem could write a restoration plan for itself, what would be the first instruction? And I also want to say, if you want to talk about mythical, Magic, The Gathering, or D&D ecosystem, feel free.
Okay.
I think the very first thing any ecosystem would say is listen to me or observe me or pay attention more than anything else.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Live with me. I feel like that's when a lot of restoration these days sort of has this idea of how do we as humans, as one species, and Aldo Leopoldi about it, just sort of one citizen of this ecosystem, how do we do the things we can do through the ability we can to restore things, but also just be just a citizen of that ecosystem.
Yeah.
Excellent. Maybe I'll escalate this one a little bit more. What plant or apex predator would you trust to give you life advice?
Well, before you introduce apex predator, my answer is going to be some species of like mycorrhizae fungi.
Oh, sorry. It's so binary in that. I've been considering other life forms. I apologize.
But I mean, in traditional fashion, I would ask the wolf what it thinks about everything, and especially how it feels about being reintroduced into its homeland.
That's pretty good. I'd say old growth oak tree, maybe. I don't know. Like, how do I get to where you are? That's what I want. I want to live a nice, long, healthy life, like a good old growth oak.
If an ecosystem had a theme song, which song would you pick? And this is a ploy to get you to contribute to my playlist I've been developing.
Yeah, that's good. I just thought any Sigur Rós song seems right.
I wanted to give just a cop-out answer and say any Tom Petty song for like sagebrush steppe ecosystem or like anywhere wide open and beautiful. But at the same time, I was just going through songs I've listened to frequently when I don't know why I kept thinking about sagebrush steppe. I think I just need to start heading east. But I'd recommend Cold Day in the Sun by Foo Fighters. That's a great song too.
Good song.
Foo Fighters has a new album coming out pretty soon.
I heard.
Yeah.
Looking forward to it.
All right. I think it's a wrap, guys. Appreciate you coming on podcast again.
Yeah, thank you.
Our pleasure, Michael. Thank you.
Yeah, it's great. I don't know how much endurance you have on this topic, but I hope to hear more. But no pressure. I don't know. It sounds like you have a lot going on.
No, I think there's more stuff to mine, not to make a data mining pun. There's definitely more to mine here, I think. And I think Sam put it really well. This is a big technological jump, and these tools are becoming more accessible. And that's sort of what prompted us. We need to think about these things more.
Right. And Tim and I both generate so many answers from chatbots, I felt like I needed to contribute to the environment a little bit more. So I started working in some restoration projects in between then and now.
I planted some bushes in my yard to feel better about what I was.
Cool. All right. Well, I'll see you soon.
Cool. Thanks, Michael. Yeah, anytime.
Yeah. All right, that was my conversation version 2 with Tim and Sam. First off, huge thanks to both of them for coming back on the show. It's always a good sign when guests are willing to revisit a conversation a couple years later and say, okay, what actually happened? What did we get right? What did we miss? And what's gotten weirder? And honestly, things have gotten a little weirder. I think one of my biggest takeaways from this conversation, and it's something they said in a few different ways, is that AI isn't necessarily giving us new restoration ideas. It's mostly reflecting back the ones we've been publicly circulating. You know, plant natives, remove invasives, enhance habitat, monitor. And then again, none of that is wrong. I spend a lot of my time doing exactly that. But when that becomes the default script across every ecosystem, that's when it starts to feel a little thin, you know, a little copy and paste ecology. And I think Tim said it really well. These tools don't really ask the deeper questions of what our restorations are for, who benefits, decides, what story we're stepping into, or our blind spots. And Sam had the line that I'm probably going to keep thinking about over and over. A chatbot will never admit it's wrong unless you call it out on its bullcrap. Which honestly, same could be said for a lot of systems we work inside of. And then there's the other layer that we touched on toward the end, which is the environmental footprint of AI itself. Its impact on lands, waters, energy, infrastructure that could be used for natural ecosystems. We're using these massive resource-intensive systems to help us imagine ecological repair, and I don't think that's a contradiction we need to solve today, but it's definitely one we should sit with, because restoration is always full of paradox. We thin trees to restore forests. We are moving species around to quote-unquote stabilize ecosystems or to restore balanced ecosystems. We intervene when we don't have all the information available to us. And now we're asking machines trained on our own incomplete stories to help guide that work. So that's a lot, but I don't come away from this conversation feeling cynical. If anything, I feel like this just reinforces something I already believe about restoration, that the work is about attention, a relationship, it's about noticing what's missing, and maybe that's where AI is actually useful, not as a decision maker, but as a kind of mirror, a slightly awkward, overly confident mirror that shows us the patterns we've been repeating. And then it's on to us to decide whether or not we want to keep repeating them or do something different. If you got something out of this episode, I'd really appreciate it if you shared it with someone, another practitioner, a student, someone who's been curious or skeptical about AI in this space. You can also follow along on social media at TreeHuggerPod. I'm trying to be a little more active there. Sometimes it's just memes about plants, which is the joy of the internet mostly. If you want to support the show directly, you can do that too. There are links in the show notes to donate and subscribe or just throw a little fuel into the tank. This is independent podcasting, no big machine behind it, just me, a few microphones, a few subscriptions, and a lot of curiosity. And if you got thoughts, especially on this one, I'd love to hear them. Are you using AI in your restoration work? Have you found it helpful, frustrating, concerning, totally overhyped? Send me a message, shoot me an email, leave a comment. I actually read that stuff and it shapes where the podcast goes next. And as always, take care of yourselves and your community and the places you're in relationship with. Pay attention to those stories, especially the ones that aren't being told. And maybe before you ask the chatbot what to do next, spend a minute asking the land itself. All for now, see you in the woods.